Conquest of America, Part 2. Once again, we return to the same point. Forced labor systems, like the mita and encomiendas. In the end, many people speak very positively about the encomiendas, that workers were paid, but ultimately, it was still forced labor, right? As much as I would like to frame it as simply a form of labor organization, it was still forced labor. The mita was forced, and many times it was for life. So, this type of crowding in indigenous towns and the forced labor, these living conditions, all contributed greatly to the spread of disease, which claimed many more lives. We can't talk about exact numbers because for these periods it's very complicated. There are studies that estimate between 20 and 90 million. When the range is that wide, it's very difficult to be precise. Most studies estimate around 50 to 60 million across the entire continent. In Central America, it's estimated around 7 million. In the Mexico-Mesoamerican region, around 20 million. In South America, there were also other populations of many millions. And from the time of the conquest until around 1610, approximately 90% of the population was lost. And how do we know that? Because there were already records of indigenous towns, and many of those towns practically disappeared. That's how we know that the majority of the indigenous population perished. During the time of the conquest, the process wasn't the same in Central America, Mesoamerica, and South America. Some battles were much bloodier, depending on the indigenous groups in each region and how much they resisted. For example, in the Araucanian region in southern Chile, there were very brutal battles, basically extermination, while in some other cases, things were much more benevolent, in quotes, where indigenous peoples did not resist, so there was no need for war. You see, the Spanish were very practical when they came. If war was necessary, they would fight it. But if they could avoid it, they would, because war meant losing lives and resources. Many of the Spaniards, the conquistadors, came in search of wealth. This is very important. The logic was, I came here to look for land because we are second-born sons and won't inherit anything in Spain. So we come to the Americas to make a living, to look for gold, for wealth, for land. The first contingents that came recruited people because they needed manpower and didn't have money to hire, so they recruited whoever they could. But it quickly became clear that this would require more skilled people in navigation and in weapons. Later, they would also need people who could read, write, and were educated. So naturally, the type of people being brought over became more complex. It wasn't just a handful of sailors helping get from point A to point B. Now they also needed different types of specialists and scholars. Even Cortés studied. He didn't finish his studies, but he spoke Latin, could read and write, had a fair knowledge of philosophy, and had read some ancient texts. So, to a certain extent, it is true that the first ones coming over were funding their own expeditions. This is another myth. It is often believed that the crown paid for everything, and they all came under the same banner, but that's simply not true. They funded themselves or sought financing independently. For example, they weren't just one group. Cortés had conflicts with Diego Velázquez, who in turn had problems with Diego Colón. Then there's the case of Almagro versus Pizarro, where they ended up in a civil war in Peru, two Spanish factions. Diego Velázquez sent Pánfilo de Narváez to arrest Cortés, leading to a conflict in which Narváez was captured. So they weren't a single unified contingent, but they did have a sense of unity. And that's very important, because during the conquest, that unity as Spaniards would be crucial. They saw themselves as a bloc when it was time to act as one, and then they would make alliances or wage wars as needed to ensure their own wealth. Cortés wanted the conquest for himself. He did not want to give it to Diego Velázquez, so he defended his conquest, and the same pattern would repeat across the continent. Conquistadors who overstepped boundaries set by other conquistadors, conquering territories for themselves, ending up in conflict with one another. Why? Because they were seeking royal grants, land, and wealth. The vast majority ended up poor. Their expeditions failed. For example, the expeditions to Florida, where Panfilo de Narvaez died, and the story of Cabeza de Vaca begins. He entered Florida and ended up exiting somewhere in northern Mexico. He spent several years encountering many indigenous groups and ended up surviving with only one companion, an African slave. In the end, they were the only survivors of that expedition, in which 500 people died. Many of them funded their own expeditions, searching for riches and land, and ended up dying. So yes, it's true that many of those Spaniards came specifically looking for gold. Others simply came as hired men under the conquistadors. And what was Christopher Columbus like? Columbus was a great admiral in the sense that he was very skilled in the art of navigation. He had practically dedicated his entire life to it. Commerce, ships. He knew a great deal about navigation. When he came up with the idea of finding a way around the Muslim blockade of the silk and salt routes, he first brought the idea to the King of England, but it was rejected. Then he brought it to the Portuguese. They also rejected it. Finally, he presented it to the Castilians, to the Castilian monarchs, who gave him attention. When he first set out, he went with the writings of Marco Polo. Marco Polo, the great explorer who traveled much of China, Asia, and Southeast Asia. He had a journal from Polo where he described what he encountered. So when Columbus arrived at the first islands of the Caribbean, he read Marco Polo's journal and said, "These birds are similar to those Polo described. The forest, the people, they look similar." So he said, "I've reached the Indies." His 4 voyages were focused on trying to explore that archipelago he had found, to try and make sense of it. What he didn't know was that he had run into an impenetrable continent, and the only way through was to the south. He died without ever knowing that. What happened? On some of those voyages, he stayed for quite a long time. He started establishing settlements, and he brought enslaved people. So, as an administrator, he was actually quite bad. He was also a tyrant. At one point, he got stranded with a crew in Jamaica, and with that, they had rebuilt a small boat to send to the other Antilles to ask for help. People found out that Columbus was in Jamaica, and for a whole year, they didn't go to rescue him because they were hoping he would die. And that's what happened because people did not like Christopher Columbus. Later, when he was taken back to Spain in chains, he faced trials and was found guilty. So, Columbus needs to be understood in context. A great admiral, but as an administrator, he was a real tyrant. He enslaved the populations he encountered, and he treated even his own sailors and Spaniards with terrible cruelty. He was a man of the 16th century, but with very different notions of morality and ethics than what we have today. I wouldn't glorify him too much. As an admiral and explorer, I think he's notable, but beyond that, I think the rest of his life was marked by disgraceful actions. As for the gap between continental advancements and human innovation, much consideration also needs to be put into the correct context. Starting with some civilizations, like the Tarascans or the Purepecha, depending on which term we use, it's the same civilization. They were already entering the Copper Age, what is called the Chalcolithic period. Most others were still in the Stone Age. But it's complicated to talk about this because advancement in certain areas, what we would call today science, like astronomy, for example, in some civilizations was not at the same stage as in the Old World Stone Age. So it was their own form of development, what history refers to as independent development. The American civilizations had their own path of development. But is it true, for example, that the Incas never discovered the wheel? Well, there are records showing that wheels were used, but not in the way they were used in Europe, for example. In many cases, the terrain didn't allow for it. In other cases, other systems of transportation or engineering had already been developed that did not require the wheel. When we talk about the New World, it really is a new world. That is to say, the American continent began to be populated by Homo sapiens quite late. We're talking about roughly 20,000 years ago, depending on the archaeological records. Between 20,000 and 23,000 years ago is when the first humans are believed to have arrived. But these were waves that came over a period of many, many thousands of years. The last migration waves occurred around 12,000 years ago, when the Bering Land Bridge closed, when the ice melted and people could no longer cross. That was around 12,000 years ago. And yes, it's true that people came through other routes, but we're talking about major migrations. The contacts from Polynesia, for example, involved seafaring peoples with established routes who also reached the coasts of South America. But these weren't large enough to populate a continent. Nor were the Vikings. The Vikings established a few settlements in parts of Canada and on some islands, but they didn't conquer or settle the land. They quickly returned. According to estimates, their settlements lasted less than 60 years. These major migrations, however, were true migrations. Thousands of years of continuous movement. Nearly 10,000 years of people arriving, wave after wave. So when the earliest populations were reaching the south of the continent, people were still arriving in the north. It's an enormous continent. That gives us an idea of the scale. So over 10,000 years, different cultures arrived, each with different technologies and languages. That's why there's such a wide variety of languages between North and South America. And in between, the linguistic differences are even more extreme. It's an immense diversity, not just of languages, but also of peoples and types of cultures. Even ritual cannibalism is believed to have been brought by populations who had practiced it since ancient times. But the cultures in the Americas also had a significant difference from those in the Old World. So we have to be very careful when comparing civilizations. In the Mediterranean region, for example, there's a very important feature: commerce across the entire area. This allowed for innovations from Asia, from North America, and from the European side of the Mediterranean to circulate and be shared. The Phoenicians invented the alphabet, which was later adopted by the Greeks, modified by the Romans, and then spread throughout the Mediterranean. We also had navigational innovations. In going even further back, in Egypt, Mesopotamia, in the regions of Anatolia, we find the independent development of hieroglyphic writing systems. Everyone also generates their own knowledge, writing, for example, cuneiform, and others. And all of these are types of knowledge that have been shared for thousands of years. not just animals, grains, or general plants, but knowledge itself. For over 3,000 years, different civilizations have been sharing knowledge through trade. We're talking about the last populations that arrived in the Americas having come around 12,000 years ago. At that time, in the Mediterranean, for example, 12,000 years ago, the great civilizations did not yet exist. So we're talking about a moment when the American civilizations, or rather, the American inhabitants, had just finished arriving, and there still wasn't development happening in parts of Asia or the Mediterranean either. We're mainly talking about the hunter-gatherers 12,000 years ago. It is believed that agriculture did not yet exist anywhere in the world. So we're talking about a division in time when even the first farmers had not yet appeared. The first farmers are said to have emerged around 9,000 years ago, by which time the Bering Land Bridge had already closed. Therefore, all the development of the Americas and the rest of the world happened in completely separate worlds. They didn't even have a similar starting point. For example, agriculture in the Americas developed around 5,000 years ago, while in the rest of the world, we can talk about it starting around 9,000 years ago. A difference of 4,000 years in the domestication of animals and plants. Also, the animals we had in the Americas, some animals that existed in the Old World did not exist here. These are animals that evolved alongside humans, and therefore were more accustomed to humans and more easily domesticated. That was not the case in the Americas. So there's a huge difference. There were no horses, no cows, no animals for labor. This led to a completely different way of organizing labor, of doing agricultural work, and of transportation. All of these differences, for example, in technological discovery, can be seen in the Purepecha civilization. They started working with copper, but only very recently, shortly before the Conquest, so their knowledge did not have time to spread across the rest of the continent. While in other regions of the world, people had already been working with copper for 2,000 years prior. They had already advanced from the Copper Age to the Bronze Age, and then to the Iron Age. In fact, by the time the Spanish arrived in the Americas, they already had steel. And without horses, cows, and such, animal protein sources were not easy to come by. Could that have influenced the persistence of cannibalism over a long period of time? In some cases, yes, but we also have to understand cannibalism in the Americas depending on the culture we are talking about. There were cultures where cannibalism was practiced purely for meat consumption, but we're talking about much more rudimentary civilizations like the Caribs. For example, Caribbean civilizations didn't have monumental sculpture. When we talk about monumental sculpture, we mean the working of large stone units, monoliths, of considerable size. Anthropologists use this kind of indicator to classify the complexity of the civilization. They also use ceramics, for example. If the ceramics have different colors and greater variety, that suggests a larger population, and therefore greater population complexity. If we are talking about monumental sculpture, it means there were people dedicated exclusively to sculpting large stone monoliths. This implies there was an institutional and administrative structure that allowed for specialized artisans. When that doesn't exist, it means available human resources had to be dedicated to other tasks, like hunting or gathering. So there wasn't time to spend on things like crafting. That was the case with Caribbean civilizations. In Mesoamerica, things were different because the civilizations were much more complex. So when we talk about cannibalism there, we have to talk specifically about ritual cannibalism, because it was part of a ritual. For example, the Mexica. When they sacrificed someone, it depended on the year, on whether there was a change in the ruler, on whether there was an eclipse or a change in the era. That influenced the numbers. Yes, it's true that in the final years of the Mexica Empire, there may have been a few years, especially when the last rulers took power, that coincided with an eclipse and the end of an era. We're talking about many events occurring close together, and in that context, it's possible to speak of thousands being sacrificed. But before that, there are archaeological records indicating fewer than 1,000 sacrifices in most years. So, there's a very big difference from one year to another, or from one period to another, or even from one ruler to the next. We're talking about ritual cannibalism. People were sacrificed, but not to be eaten simply. That is, I wouldn't sacrifice a person in order to eat them. The intention wasn't to eat them. Eating them was part of the ritual, but the sacrifice was made to the gods so the sun would rise, so that it would rain, etc., to receive benefits from the gods. Once these people were sacrificed, the heart would go to the elites, a leg would go to the warriors, and so on. Usually the common people did not eat or receive anything. We're talking about a population between 100 and 200,000 people, and in a normal year, around 600 people were being sacrificed. Of course, this wasn't some sort of food supply machine. Marcelo Goujo says it was a cannibalistic empire, but that is a statement made with malice. It assigns an adjective to an empire whose system was not based on feeding on human flesh. So yes, we can say that some civilizations did practice it due to a scarcity of protein, but not all. We cannot generalize and say that the practice of human sacrifice in the Americas was exclusively because there were no animals. That would be a mistake many people make. Again, I simply want to emphasize that we should put things in context. It's that simple. Let's place the Spaniards in their own time as men of their time. Let's place the indigenous peoples as people of their time in civilizational contexts. Let's also place the friars and even the Catholic Church in their historical context. We're talking about events that happened 500 years ago. The logic at the time was pre-modern at best, if not pre-contemporary. The notions of people didn't exist as we understand them today. Nations didn't exist as we understand them today. When we say Spain conquered us, or Spain conquered them, that wasn't the Spain we know of today. Today's Spain is the Spanish nation state. What conquered them was the Kingdom of Castile, which later transformed into the Spanish Empire, which then fragmented and gave rise to modern Spain. In other words, between Castile and today's Spain, there was an empire in the middle, and these differences are fundamental in order to understand the historical processes.